Hi, everybody on Zoom. I hope that you can hear me.
I can now.
I see people connecting. So I'm going to give them a second to get all comfy and connected via the Zoom. All right. I know this is like so attractive with the mask hanging from my ear. I should not be able to do that. But hi, everybody that's here in person. So for those, thank you, Scott, for the thumbs up. I appreciate it. I know that I can be heard. So for those who don't know me, my name is Jen. I'm the Visitor Services and Rental Coordinator here at Arch Street Meeting House. And we decided to have this event in collaboration with Eastern State Penitentiary to celebrate the Quaker connections that exist at Eastern State. Who has been to Eastern State? Ooh, I love it. Lots of people. So who has been here before at Arch Street? Slightly less hands. Okay. So, but those that have been to both, you probably maybe have pieced together that there are connections. Some of you might not have. So this is part of the reason we are having this event tonight with Matt Murphy from Eastern State. So I have Matt's bio to be able to introduce him to everybody on Zoom and everybody here. Matt Murphy has served as a tour program supervisor at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site since 2015. Matt is responsible for creating major programming and oversees the hiring, training, and evaluation of the education staff. Matt is a seasoned expert in facilitative dialogue methodology. From Alcatraz Island to Independence National Historical Park, Matt has served as a cultural heritage interpreter at sites across the nation. And he has appeared on popular media outlets such as the Washington Post and the Travel Channel. My connection to Matt, we were hired at Eastern State at the same time in 2013. So it took us a second to figure out that it is that long ago. I have moved around to different sites. I'm now here at Arch Street, but Matt loved Eastern State and is there today and is able to share all of that wealth of knowledge with us here. So Matt, take it away.
Nice intro, Jen. Hello to everyone in the Zoom space. My name is Matt Murphy. I am the tour program supervisor at Eastern State. Just for the record, cultural heritage interpreter is a fancy way of saying a tour guide. And Jen and I have been circling each other in Philadelphia for a while now. So not only were we hired together when I was a ranger at Independence National Historical Park, she was storytelling for Historic Philadelphia. So we've just kind of been bumping into each other for a long time. So thanks so much for the invite tonight, Jen. I'm a little nervous coming to the Quaker Meeting House, telling Quakers about Quaker history, Quaker historians about Quaker history. So bear with me and just call me out if I say anything wrong. Does that make sense? Cool. So I just like a little housekeeping. I think we have like an hour to talk. I don't know how tight that timeline is, but I love lots of questions. I love to hear what you guys are thinking. I really don't mind being interrupted at all. So if I'm in the middle of a sentence, feel free to cut me off. That's basically what I'm trying to say. So I've lost my notes here for a second, but I'll go off notes for a moment. So this is just some fun B-roll of Eastern State if you've never been before. So if you have never been to Eastern State, you're not from Philadelphia, you don't get around the town much. There we are in the Fairmount section of the city, just north of Center City. It often surprises our visitors. We're kind of off the main tourist track. It's this big, bad old prison in the middle of what's now kind of like a bougie residential neighborhood. So I've got kind of a weird tech setup. It was not always in a bougie residential neighborhood. When Eastern State first opened its doors, October 25th, 1829, it's about a mile outside of Philadelphia in an area that was known as Cherry Hill. And that would actually be a nickname to carry for its entire operational history, Cherry Hill. And its location was chosen intentionally. It was close enough to serve as a visible deterrent for crime, but also close enough to benefit from intellectual infrastructure in the city, even public transportation. It was also a public health measure. Most theories of disease back then centered around ideas around bad air, what they called miasma, So it was like a nice, healthy, bucolic environment with lots of fresh air. Not totally wrong, not totally right. Pulling up my notes here now. Great. But before we jump in any further, I always like to step back and talk about like, well, why learn about Eastern State? What is the value in a visit to Eastern State? There's actually a lot of old abandoned prisons across the United States. They're not super uncommon if you know where to look for them. Eastern State's a little bit different. So part of the talk, aside from the Quaker history of the building, is kind of making the case for Eastern State as one of the most important prisons, if not the most important prison that's ever been built. There's a lot about the modern American prison system that can be traced back to Eastern State. So its influence is really broad and deep and important. And we think, as a historic site, that our history is more important now than it's ever been. We are in the age of mass incarceration. There's about 2.2 million people locked up across the United States. Cost about $80 billion a year to incarcerate all these people. This is a pretty new phenomenon within the last 40 to 50 years. Starting around 1970, we started changing our laws and policy in a way that resulted in way more people going to prison and staying there way longer. That's, of course, a massive oversimplification, but it's good enough for the context of this talk. So my point is that looking back at kind of the granddaddy of the American prison system, one of the major starting points, it provides valuable context, some important lessons, and really, as far as a historic site is concerned, a really great place to have conversations with the general public about this stuff. I've given a lot of tours of this building. I have some former educators in the audience here, and they can tell you that what we try to do is to get people to think and to talk about mass incarceration, our prison system in general. And that's if we just do that, that's a really good start. I'm sorry, I saw a hand in the back. Yep. Yeah, so this is the rate of incarceration. The question was, does it track with population growth? I don't know the exact population growth, but the short answer is no. It's wildly disproportionate to population growth, and this is rate of incarceration. So this is the parts per 100,000 that are actively incarcerated. Yeah, which is like a standard demographic metric for comparing internationally for large populations. Does that make sense? Cool. All right.
Just to talk to it, since 1970 or 75, the population of America is more or less doubled.
Yeah.
You see the population was 6 times. We've certainly gone further and double.
Absolutely. Yeah. It doesn't track with population growth at all. Yeah. And I mean, there are way more populated countries in the United States that incarcerate a fraction of their population. So this is not like a normal phenomenon.
How do we do with the environmental health system?
A lot of people point to the destruction of the state mental health system and rates of mental illness inside the prison population have increased, which is like a different issue, but yeah, that's definitely. Yeah, people point to the war on drugs as a major driver of mass incarceration, more aggressive prosecution, new drug laws, stiffer penalties.
I just wonder with the mass incarceration, the data, whether or not from the 70s, they got information reference to the inner cities or major cities in this country versus other areas in this country as far as the data is concerned, as far as mass incarceration.
Yeah.
Like, where did they get that part of information from? Did they get it from the inner cities, or did they get it from the states, or did they get it from the counties or the rural areas, or?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I take your point. It is based off of county jails, state prisons, and federal prisons. But I think to your point is that the people who are incarcerated are not evenly spread throughout the country, right? They are from a few select communities, usually poor, Black and brown communities in major cities. So like if you looked at Pennsylvania's incarcerated population, they're not from every county. Well, they are.
I remember there's a metric at ESP, Penitentiary, and someone said, you see how the metric went up from one point in one period, and it went up at a certain timeline in the 70s, and he said it went up. And you notice that, and I wanted you to answer that, why did it go up at that period versus before that period, it didn't have a larger number of population in the prison system? That's a good question.
Are you looking at a specific time period on this graph?
Of course, when I was there, Sean mentioned something in reference to the metric as far as the population after a certain year, as to say, do we know why that happened and why that occurred, so.
I think the best I can speak to that question is that there are a couple of major policy changes that have distinct dates. Things like the war on drugs started under the Nixon administration, which was also ramped up under the Reagan administration. And then you can see in the 90s, after the 90s, the prison population essentially doubles within like a 15 to 20 year period. That's tied to the Clinton administration's 1994 anti-violent crime bill, which earmarks almost $10 billion for prison construction alone. Yeah. Is that?
Do you think it's that directly related to the inner cities and the communities within major cities within this country? That's a good question.
That is a good question.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, no, and it's a great question, and I'm not an expert on that. I'm an expert on Eastern States history, full disclaimer. What I can say is that it's been a bipartisan political effort, and different parties have wooed different demographics, and a lot of calls for more aggressive policy, especially in the early 90s, came from the communities that were affected by crime. But it's a little more complicated than that. I don't want to oversimplify anything. Yeah. Any other questions? Wow. Okay, we're not even getting into Quaker stuff yet. Yes. Yeah, like slide 2. I have to budget my time here.
Okay, looking at the early 1900s up to 2010, it seems like the population more of the crime rate is more 2010 than it is in 1970, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm assuming this. Now, I also assume that the situation that either though the demographics had changed since 1900, the 50s and the 60s, it looked like the crime rate wasn't that high. But when it got to like the early 90s, it just started to skyrocket. What can I say that made that start up in system of mass incarceration?
There's an important distinction to be made between incarceration rates and crime rates. And so what this shows is incarceration rates. And an important second point to make is that incarceration rates and crime rates are largely independent of each other. So what I think you might be referring to is there was a staggering crime spike in the rate of crime in the 70s and 80s, and then a precipitous drop in the 90s. And there's like a whole field of scholarship dedicated to the crime drop in the 90s. But the point is that while crime rates went like this, incarceration rates went like this.
So then, after 2010, so are we assuming that the crime rate has jumped 3 times fold?
No, in fact, if you focus on violent crime rates are almost identical to what they were in 1970, almost to the 100th. Yeah.
Also, you have to also consider that in the demographic sections, like I live in Fairmount, and I've noticed anything past Fairmount going up towards Ridge, towards 32nd, the crime rate has tripled. And it's not the older, more mature people who are having problems. It's the teenagers, and they're killing each other. Not even talking about 12, 13, 14 year olds killing each other.
Yeah, I
Where
mean,
did they get the guns from?
everybody here is probably from Philly or the Philly area. So yeah, the Philly area has got lots and lots of issues and unique challenges when it comes to crime rate. We've had a huge burst in violent crime lately.
And it's not that area, but mostly like it's up to K-Neck, Northern Liberties, and up part towards like Strawberry Ranch and a little more further up from there. From that area alone, in the last 35 years, there has been no crime rate. And now, since there's no things for these kids to go to, like going to a camp or something for the summer, the crime rate has jumped, and the crime rate has jumped, and the guns have really risen at the part. And whoever the commissioner, whoever is in Philadelphia, she's not doing her part much as she's supposed to, but she's not getting out there and know where the demographics of what's really happening.
I'm really excited that everyone is so invested in this. It sounds like this group has a lot of investment in these issues and thinks a lot really hard about this stuff. So that's really awesome. And I really thank you for putting it out there. Yeah, so this stuff is all super, that's my point, right? All this stuff is extremely relevant. Philadelphia, until a couple of years ago, for a while, was the most incarcerated large city in the United States. So this is a community that acutely feels these issues. So that's something we take into consideration when we bring in people from the local Philadelphia community, especially young children who might be directly affected by these issues. So we try to be aware of where we're coming from. We always try to take a trauma-aware approach to interpreting a building that's about prison, the loss of freedom.
I want to piggyback on what he said, when he mentioned something about mental health and behavioral health and the issues around funding. Do you think that has a lot to do with the increase of the mass population of prisons within the state or within major urban cities throughout this country? Because we hear a lot of people talk about, and there's a stigma that's attached with being mental, or whatever you say, or any issue around it. Do you think, how do you tackle that issue when it comes to being transparent and trying to understand a lot of the issues that a lot of people, trauma's another issue, and dealing with LGBT communities that are marginalized, or issues around the globe, wherever.
Yeah.
It affects us all, you know.
Well, I think as it relates to prison again, I think, and this is something that the founders of Eastern State were interested in maybe a weird way that we wouldn't agree with, but people are interested in like, what are the best predictors of someone's chances of going to prison, right? Like, what are the things that happen to people earlier in their life that lead to them being incarcerated? Trauma, witnessing violence in real life, having a role model or a parent who's been incarcerated, attending a failing school. These are all great predictors of going to prison later in life. And so by examining those things and understanding them, maybe we can prevent people from going to prison in the first place, right? Yeah.
It seems like the prison system has not really progressed more than it has when it was the Quakers. It seems like it's not doing enough for the inmates who are in the people. Okay.
I totally agree with you, and I think that's a great alley-oop into the Quaker stuff.
But it seems like the prison system has not really advanced.
I'm not in front of Zoom, sorry.
It has, consistent of doing what they're supposed to be doing, but after the person get out of prison and they come back into society, they can't make it out here. I give them 2 years.
Yeah, and
Whatever that little thing you're into, and they're back into the clinic again.
And the numbers back you up. So we are essentially, many people believe, operating under a 200-year-old model. And that model starts at Eastern State. So one thing I want to talk about is kind of like the intellectual heritage, where this all came from, specific to, the Quaker experience. So that's why we're here, right? We're at the Arch Street Meeting House. So now a lot's been made of the Quaker influence on Eastern State. I hear the city bus guides driving by Eastern State going, or I hear YouTubers talking about it. They say, oh, it's the Quaker prison and the Quaker city. And, everybody was a Quaker. The guards were Quakers. And the Quakers were obsessed with solitary confinement, and on and on and on and on. Unfortunately, the truth's a little bit more complicated. I would say safely that a lot of that is overblown. The influence is there, but it's a little more complicated. So we're going to tonight try and parse out what exactly the role Quaker individuals and Quaker thinking played in the establishment of Eastern State and then its administration as a prison. Also in its the creation of its infamous system of solitary confinement. And then also in a broader sense, thinking about how Quakers have essentially shaped modern incarceration in general. So this heritage passes through Eastern State into today. Does that make sense? Cool. So 2 questions essentially. Was Eastern State really the Quaker prison? And how did Quaker thought influence the creation of the modern prison? So the second question I'm just going to answer right away. Harry Elmer Barnes wrote in 1927 the tidiest and most accurate answer that I could find. So I'll just read it for you. The great contribution of the West Jersey and Pennsylvania Quakers to the development of modern penology consists in the twofold achievement of substituting imprisonment for corporal punishment in the treatment of criminals and of combining the prison and the workhouse, which at that point were often separate institutions. They originated both the idea of imprisonment as the typical mode of punishing crime and the doctrine that this imprisonment should not be in idleness, but at hard labor. So pairing incarceration and work. And then a century later, which is where Eastern State comes in. So this is what he's talking about so far is in the 18th century. They added the principle that imprisonment and hard labor should be in cellular separation and thus created the modern prison system in its entirety. So the idea of putting people in cells, which is like what we all kind of imagine in our mind when we think of a prison, is not a foregone conclusion and was relatively new at that point. So it's important then to understand what prisons were like before Eastern State and what Eastern State was trying to do differently and improve upon. This is an illustration of a prison called Newgate in London, England, around 1818. And it gives us a pretty good idea what prisons and jails were like at this time. They were usually really squalid, dirty, chaotic places that were communal in nature, people living in common spaces, men, women, adults, and children, people convicted of violent offenses and nonviolent offenses. There were rarely provisions for feeding and clothing people in jails. They relied on charity or begging. So typhus, tuberculosis killed huge swaths of the population, so they were really unhealthy places. And it's important to note that they were really not the punishment themselves, as Barnes mentioned. They were really a means to an end, temporary detention while people awaited trial, and then corporal or capital punishment. So things like whipping and branding and being put in the public stock or pillory. The idea there was a kind of a layered offense, right? So it's retribution, punishment against the person who broke the law, but then also deterrent effect for the community, trying to set an example for people who are thinking about breaking the law. But then in a weird way, their trip through the system was essentially over. Maybe they were traumatized and stigmatized and changed, but it was short and painful and done. And capital punishment was also, of course, much more common at this period too. So there was a jail in Philadelphia before Eastern State. There was actually a couple, but the most notable one was the Walnut Street Jail, which is pictured here. It was directly across the street from what we call Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House. And it was built just before the start of the Revolution. And it had all these problems. It was crowded, it was chaotic, it was dirty, it had diseases, it was dysfunctional. And so a lot of the early reforms that would lead to Eastern State were started here and experimented on here. And to skip ahead a little bit, they were kind of a failure. And it would result in kind of the Pennsylvania state legislature investing in a massive way in basically a giant laboratory for their social experiment. But Pennsylvania had become famous all over the world for innovating in penology and prison reform, but it wasn't really a coincidence. It took a long time to get there. William Penn, of course, founded the colony on a philosophy of religious freedom and tolerance. His deep Quaker convictions and his own experience with incarceration influenced his thinking on criminal justice, and it led him to lay legal and cultural foundations that yielded really dramatic reforms that probably couldn't happen other places. Notably, Penn's Great Law of 1682 and the 1701 Charter of Privileges, which framed Pennsylvania's government and are a huge step towards liberal democracy, but they also contain significant criminal justice reform, including turning away from the English tradition of criminal law, which was equated with backwardness, physical brutality, and moving towards progressiveness, something that was more suitable for the New World. It severely limits the use of corporal and capital punishment for only the most serious offenses. It established a preference for incarceration, what William Penn referred to as houses of correction. He was aware of places of houses of correction in places like Belgium and the Netherlands. So he was aware of reforms that were already happening in Europe. And then he establishes reform and prevention of crime as the primary goal of the criminal justice system, which again sounds like a foregone conclusion, but punishment and deterrence were really the primary goals before that. Yeah.
You say kind of confirms the worst thing I've heard. I read up on something.
Bedlam, yeah.
And to me, if you want to have separation between the church and state, you want to make that kind of situation in check. The thing about corporal punishment is like beating and stuff like that. That doesn't make the person any more. It makes them more defined. You know, they get more. They're going to rebel more by beating them. You figure that you have to go through submission, and then figure that okay, I got them what I want.
And these guys totally agreed with you. So you would have agreed with Benjamin Rush, at least on this one point. Benjamin Rush had a lot of crazy ideas, but so there was a group formed agreeing with your point in 1787, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, and they disagreed with the way criminal justice looked in the new republic. So I should step back one phase. So a lot of what William Penn did was reversed in the early 18th century by what were called the Anglican Codes, which was kind of a return to English codes. So corporal punishments, capital punishment became common again. But then this group was formed and they disagreed with it, and they wanted to create a system that was more befitting of like an enlightened republic, something that was different from nasty old Europe. And they're inspired partially by what they see at the Walnut Street jail. They see a dysfunctional prison. They don't agree with the role that prison is playing in society. They think that we can do better. Now, it included some of those powerful Americans alive. You see Benjamin Franklin, Dr. Benjamin Rush. It's Bishop William White there in the middle, who's notably one of the major founders of a major leader in the Episcopal faith in the New World. And so this is one of the primary ways that the Quaker influence gets into the building. Somewhere between a third and a half of the membership of this organization in the period leading up to Eastern State's opening was Quaker. And that's one of the primary ways they influenced the building. Now, notably, nobody on this poster is a Quaker, and two of these guys didn't even live to see Eastern State open. But so I'll just talk about some of the Quaker ideas that influenced this organization. So there's a Quaker idea that people are born inherently good, and that people are worthy of reform, and that you can become good again. Importantly, they believe in nonviolence, at least most of them do. And so that includes criminal justice. So if it's wrong to attack people and murder people, then it's wrong to whip people and execute people. So they're trying to create an alternative. And now this one's like debatable, and I don't know how I feel about this one. A lot of people, I think sometimes people apply this, make a logical jump here. You know, if you ever go to a Quaker meeting, people sit in silence for the most part. There's no one talking at the lectern, but silence and silent reflection would be really important in the early years of Eastern State. It's unclear if the Quakers like necessarily put that into motion. Debatable though. But they're asking themselves a big question, right? Like, what are prisons for? So why don't we stop and take a minute and think about what we think prisons are for? We've laid out a couple of the classic reasons: deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation. One more I would say is incapacitation, which is probably the biggest reasons we have prisons today in this country. We think we should take dangerous or disruptive people off the street and put them into jail cells. What do you guys think? Are there other reasons? Which ones do you agree with? I knew you were going to raise your hand.
Murder. Kill somebody, got to pay the price.
So retribution. You said reform. Yeah, rehabilitating people. Broken person.
It allows the state to monopolize violence and rebrand it as justice.
Okay, so putting violence in the hands of the state and putting it through a filter. I like that. Okay, so victims' rights. Yeah, that might be lumped under retribution, but that is an important distinction to make. Yeah.
I was going to say the fundamental problem is that punishment and rehabilitation equal to both at the same time, and that's the fundamental problem of the prison system. Is it punishment? Is it rehabilitation? And that's important. You can't do both at the same time.
Some people think prison is just simply a flawed premise and not able to do the things we want them to do. So there's a lot of people who agree with that. Yeah.
No treatment of women, children, and as he said, you can't put them two animals in the same thing. You think one in the lab. Okay. It's like if you're going to put something of retribution, do it and make the person realize this is what the crime you have done. The retribution is serve your time, do what you have to do. But when you come out of prison, make sure you stay with your parole officer and keep them abreast of what you're trying to do with your life. But it doesn't always apply because murderers come out and at the 15 to 20 years, they're back in the same old bag again. They run back out there killing the man and doing everything on that.
We'll file that under different strokes for different folks.
There you go.
Labor. Okay, can you say more about that?
Having a workforce that you can literally control under all duress to do labor for the state.
Yeah, so prison labor is one of the most controversial parts of our prison system today. They're one of the only people you can pay less than minimum wage. A couple states they can be compelled to work. Yeah. Okay, so maybe that connects to what you're saying. So in a different way though, maybe like putting a legal venue for violence. Yeah. In the back there.
Basically, it's being passed out.
So yeah, so kind of like a negative zone, as Superman would put it, a place to take people out of.
It's about sin and saving your soul.
Okay. So reform, rehabilitation, I'll put it under that one. Damon, what's up? Tell me more.
It's all your, your rights and perhaps civil and human rights. You lose your kind of ability to be a member of society in legal and non-legal ways.
So yeah, voting, access to entitlement programs and housing, all sorts of things. Yeah. So that's part of the reason why people often end up back in prison. Is they face many barriers upon reentry.
I would hope it would be determined, but I don't think the statistics prove that.
Yeah, I think if mass incarceration is failing one thing, it's deterrence, right? Obviously, people end up back in prison. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You said it costs $80 billion a year
Yeah.
to, I guess, incarcerate people or the population currently. Going back to the point on labor, how much are
That I would love to know that number, and I don't know it. So the question was about how much money are prisoners putting into the economy.
Are prisoners in Pennsylvania laboring, working, making license plates?
They are. And interestingly, we've done some, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
They're still doing it?
Yeah, there's Pennsylvania has its own like corporation just for, it's called Big House Industries. Yeah, cute little play on words. In the back there, in the nosebleed, sorry.
Just to that person, I can tie this back to Quaker history that a previous job at Pennsylvania Manor, we employed, we did not employ, we forced 2 prisoners to work at Pennsylvania, because it's run by the state of Pennsylvania, and it's just in the system. And so two people are forced to work at William Penn's country estate under the current system, which seems like there's some horrid poetry in there.
Yeah, and so the Quakers do have a role in, well, I don't want to overstate it, but the prisoners thought a lot about what labor should be like in prison. Yeah, one more comment and then we'll move on.
That when after a person has been incarcerated to come out, the suicide rate is up to 85%.
I don't know the numbers on that, but people do face a myriad of mental health challenges. People in prison are more likely to commit self-harm in general than people in solitary, much more likely, which we'll hear about in Eastern States history. Yeah, one more, and we'll keep going.
I think there's a point of view that's being missed. Prison isn't always punishment. There's this notion of benevolence that you're saving their soul. Today, I know people who commit crimes to get themselves back into prison because they can't handle the lack of social services when they're on their own, and they have substance abuse issues that they know prison will keep them from abusing. So they more or less choose prison again because social services don't deliver for them.
Yeah, some people call that 3 hots and a cot theory. A lot of people, it's a pretty hotly debated idea. There is some evidence of at least one guy who wanted to go back to Eastern State, but I'm not an expert on that. Okay, so back to Quaker stuff. That was a great conversation, so thanks everyone for piping in. So John Howard and Jeremy Bentham, John Howard on the left there, Jeremy Bentham on the right. So these ideas were not created in a vacuum. The Philadelphia Society did not cook it up on their own. They were influenced by reforms happening in England and the European continent, and these were their 2 primary influences. Howard was famous for writing a lengthy report on the prisons of England and Wales after touring prisons throughout the European continent. And then he advocated for major reforms back home in England. He was disgusted by squalor and suffering and the prevalence of disease. He spent a lot of the rest of his life thinking of ways to mitigate disease. He would ultimately die from a disease he caught in a military camp. And then he was no softy though. He also heavily stressed the value of hard labor and solitary confinement in prison. So he had this kind of like dual nature to his thinking. And then on the right, you have a picture of Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. Jeremy Bentham popularized this idea of an octagonal structure that would allow an observer in the middle of the building to watch everyone in their cells or units all the time. And this was this kind of like scary dystopian idea that if you could be watched all the time, then you'll do the right thing for fear of the consequences. And this is influential on Eastern State. Eastern State is not a panopticon, strictly speaking, but it does influence the design of the building, at least ideologically, yeah. Anyone who's like taking a sociology class or read Foucault has heard about the panopticon. There's I forgot I had the slide. And that's Eastern State's original radial plan. So the idea was a guard could hang out in that circular center in the middle, and then, kind of just spin around and keep an eye on hundreds of people living in solitary confinement, which we'll talk about a lot. Sorry, I'm pointing at the screen. So Bentham himself was a Quaker. And there was an international Quaker connection between the Philadelphia Society and Howard. English Quaker physicians, John Fothergill on the left and John Lettsam, they worked closely with Howard and were longtime correspondents with Benjamin Rush. So they were the ones that kind of clued him in into all the fun stuff happening in Europe. And then Rush, probably more than any one person, translated Howard's ideas in the United States and laid out a vision for the penitentiary that would become Eastern State. So there's a direct connection there. Some other interesting connections I thought were cool. William Bradford on the right there, who's the Attorney General of the United States, worked closely with Quaker iron merchant Caleb Lowndes, who's not pictured here. I couldn't find a picture of him. Caleb Lowndes was a prominent member of the Philadelphia Society, an inspector at the Walnut Street Jail. They revised the Anglican-inspired penal codes of the state so that the death penalty was eliminated for all crimes except for premeditated murder. And that's the first governor of Pennsylvania, Mifflin. He worked with the two directly to revise those penal codes. Cruel physical punishments were replaced with imprisonment and hard labor for standardized periods of time. And they, in essence, returned to William Penn's great law, at least in spirit. So the Quakers really had two thrusts when it came to criminal justice reform: advocating at a policy level and then advising at the level of prison administration. So they're kind of in both worlds. Any questions so far? I feel like yeah. Hard labor, yeah. So originally it took the form of working on the streets, cleaning and doing city works, things like that. And that would actually lead to reforms because a lot of the guys on the street, they were like tied to like cannonballs and stuff, and they would like curse out locals and beg, and it was just kind of like a gross spectacle. And they decided to move it like inside the walls. And that was part of the appeal of prisons to these guys, is that it happened behind the walls. Everything was, that would happen with capital punishment. In 1835, capital punishment would go behind the walls of county jails instead of out in the public eye, kind of take the grossness out of it for everybody. Yeah. Right, and so then they kind of get away from the deterrent idea. So they're starting to get some muddy thinking, right?
Grants caging people till 1973. Right?
Yeah, well into the mid-20th century. I don't know the exact year. Yeah. Yep. Where? Oh, I'm sorry. Your hand is blocked. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. There's a great book about it. Damon, what's the title? Liberty's Prisoners, by a local scholar from New Jersey, and it's all about women's experience at the Walnut Street Jail. And yeah, they were divided different working spaces and different job details. And more importantly, it's like, and on a macro sense, the penitentiary was really thought up of with white guys in mind, to be honest. At least that's one theory, is that white men were the ones thought capable of reform through the prison system. There were other diversionary institutions for women, like the Magdalene Society for reforming sex workers, and the mills, the textile mills out in Manayunk and Roxborough are often carceral in nature. But we can talk a little bit more about what it's like to be a woman at Eastern State when we get there. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. At Eastern State in the 1800s, the racial segregation was not super formal because everybody was in solitary confinement. And so it wasn't deemed necessary. As solitary confinement started to collapse at the end of the 19th century, then it was formal. And then for the rest of the history, well, not the rest of history, then in the mid-1960s, the prison desegregates again. Oh, I guess you had to ask the person going through it. I'm sure everyone had their own experience, but by most people really hate solitary confinement, and it seems like an awful endeavor to go through. Self-harm, suicide, mental illness were very serious problems at Eastern State. So that leads me into this. So they start so there's a law passed in 1790. They start their experiments at the Walnut Street Jail. They kept passed what's called the Penitentiary Act. They built a new wing. where everybody's going to be kept in solitary confinement. It's reserved for kind of like what they call hardened offenders, and they're going to be put in hard labor. And they think what's going to happen is people are going to think and reflect, seek penitence, and change their ways. Lots of engineering flaws, administration flaws. People got really sick. People had serious problems. I think there was at least one fatality from the experiment. But instead of backing away, they're like, this is a good idea. We just didn't, have the right tools for the job. So they spend like the next 30 years getting the money to build what becomes Eastern State Penitentiary, a purpose-built penitentiary marrying form and function, where the building is designed to support life for solitary confinement for hundreds of people, which had never really been done before. And that's one of Eastern State's really like true claims to fame. Yeah, they thought so, getting there, but we'll see that lots of problems quickly emerged with Eastern State too. So we talked about the Radial Plan. It was designed by an English architect named John Haviland. He was hired by the Philadelphia Society. He submitted the design after they kind of like put their list of wants and needs. We're building a prison of solitary confinement. What do you got? He won out over William Strickland, who was also a very prominent architect. Haviland chose to replicate Gothic castle architecture on the facade to make it scary, but on the inside, he replicated cathedral architecture. So this is a one say where I'd say you could say it drifts away from Quaker ideology. This is distinctly Catholic or Anglican cathedral architecture with high barrel arches and lots of skylights. And this is a practical way to light and ventilate the building before electricity. But if you're building a place where you want people to think about they've done wrong, why not make it look like church? So why don't we take a little walk down cell block 7 and see what it looks like today. Excuse, I don't know if there's sound on this, but you'll hear my keys jingling and my heavy breathing. Okay, then I should have said that. Now you know. It was really hot. I was distressed. Whoa, a little warped. I don't know. I think that's a projector. But it gives you a sense of scale of the building. So I'm sorry, go ahead. This cell block is, the building was open in 29. It wasn't done being built till 36. And they got about halfway through building the place and realized they needed more real estate. And so the second half of the building got a second story, which caused some engineering problems and kind of compromised that ability to watch everybody all the time. But, it's like, yeah. That's a charitable way to describe it. I would say so. Yeah. Damon, would you disagree with that? So what happens is Haviland kind of refines his design as he goes. And by the time he gets to 7, he kind of figures it out. 4, 5, and 6, the catwalks are kind of hanging over the walkway. And so it's kind of dimly lit, it's blocking all the light. He kind of pushes the catwalks back with 7 and gets this really grand, beautiful, impressive Gothic vibe to it, for lack of a better word. Okay, let's jump into the Pennsylvania system. So they did trademark this system. They called it the Pennsylvania system or the separate system, and this becomes world famous. This is the first photograph of a prisoner in their cell that we know of, and he's modeling the Pennsylvania system for us. There's 3 parts: isolation for 23 hours of the day, work, and moral instruction. If a prisoner didn't have a trade they could perform upon arrival, they were taught one by a guard who was a skilled tradesperson before they were hired. That's how you got your job back then. There was no law enforcement academy back then. So they were expected to be like teachers. It helped fund the prison. They sold the things the prisoners made, but it was also supposed to be part of the reform process. The prisoner can get a job when they get out, hopefully. Prisoners also met infrequently with a moral instructor who was usually a religious official. This is another diversion from Quaker influence. The first moral instructor for decades was a Baptist preacher named Thomas Larcombe, so he was not a Quaker. We can also see a scripture quote above the door. So even though it's established after the separation of church and state, the building does have a very pious Protestant Christian environment. But we do know they catered to the needs of Jewish prisoners here. As early as the 1840s, there was a Jewish chaplain. Pictures on the wall, maybe reminders of loved ones left behind. We don't really know. It at least shows us that they were allowed to decorate. But prisoners were not allowed visitors for many years, considered negative influences from a former life. So they were really kind of plucked out of the community and dropped into, a bit of a vortex. And we can take a tour of the cell. So the first prisoner was an 18-year-old man named Charles Williams from Harrisburg. He got convicted in Delaware County of stealing about $28 worth of goods. He was convicted of burglary. He was probably surprised to see that his cell had indoor heating, running water, a flush toilet. Every cell had one from day one, which was necessary because everyone was living in solitary. He might have noticed that his cell looked like a little chapel itself, so that motif continued into the cells. Charles slept on a cornhusk mattress. He had 2 uniforms, one for the summer, one for the winter. He was taught how to make shoes while he was at Eastern State. So he had shoemaking equipment, probably some effects for eating and drinking, not a Bible for studying. We know he was studying the Bible with a moral instructor, but not a whole lot else. Yeah. So it's the first large-scale public structure in the U.S. to have all 3 of those amenities. Really like novel and innovative, but be crude and ineffective by our standards. So lots of problem with heating and contaminated water and all sorts of problems. Drawn just drinking the Schuylkill punch right from the river. Okay, so lots of influences on the Pennsylvania system, but if you had to pin it down to 3 guys, you could probably name Thomas Bradford, Robert Tavoe, and Caleb Lowndes, all notable Quakers in Philadelphia. There was a schism within the group. Pardon? I've always heard of Vo. I've heard both. Kids from Vox High School say Vox, but yeah, I always think it's kind of French sounding, so I don't know. But I don't know. I have no idea. Quakers in the room, tell me. Are you work at Swarthmore? Okay, you're going to get credited in this. Did you know that? Vox, you say Vox? Okay, good to know. Did you know that, Damon? Yeah. You actually have, I have a little clip from your Member Saturday presentation in here. Wait, can you identify yourself for the group if you're okay?
Hi, I'm Celia. I'm she for pronouns. I'm an archivist at Swarthmore College in the French Historical Library.
So we'll talk a little bit about Anna Warren more. So I might ask you to jump in there. I had a feeling you might be. So Thomas Bradford, there was a schism within the group. Some people thought that people should just be thrown in solitary with nothing to do to kind of exacerbate the effects of solitary confinement, kind of speed things up. Thomas Bradford was in that camp. So here he writes, enough has been seen to justify the belief that its effects will be to reform entirely, to be shut up in a cell for years alone, deprived of converse with a fellow being, to have no friendly consolation, but to count the tedious hours as they pass, a prey to the corrodings of conscience and despair. Yeah. Where? I'm sorry, thanks for the help.
It sounds like this is all geared towards violent. Except for the first 2 main reasons. You're allowed to say in back or within the guy that got 25 bucks to it and never got it.
It was essentially a one-size-fits-all program. But most people at Eastern State, to be clear, in the 19th century, were in for some form of property crime, burglary, larceny, horse theft. That does shift slightly in the 20th century, trending towards more violent crimes. But, yeah, some of it. Yeah, Al Capone's cellmate was in for embezzlement. So there's evidence of that. The man who designed the Pennsylvania Capitol's dome, famous architect, was in for graft. There's a couple notable examples. Yeah. Cool. So 23 hours a day spent alone in a cell, 30 minutes in the morning and the afternoon in a little solitary exercise yard, kind of like a cubicle attached to the back. So a recognition that human beings can't really live in a little stone box without any kind of break. But they were supposed to be alone. This was an opportunity for prisoners to try to talk to each other, pass notes. Take a tour of that too. Most of them were demolished in the early 20th century and converted into other modern facilities like workshops and classrooms, prison's hospital. like this fun, like psychedelic warp to the video. I don't know. There were a lot of health problems. I read one paper that theorized that part of the reason tuberculosis was such a big problem is because people were vitamin D deficient, which seems to be common for people battling respiratory problems. I'm not a doctor, so I have no idea. That's just one. I've heard it mentioned, but I don't know. No, definitely not. Yeah, so they're not totally wrong, not totally right. Like they know people need fresh air and sunlight. So some Quaker influences after opening that we can like directly point to. The first and the third warden of Eastern State were Quakers, prominent Quakers. Samuel Wood was a Chester County mill operator. Thomas Scattergood was a member of a prominent family that touched on a lot of parts of Philadelphia. We know that Quaker members of the Philadelphia Society visited the prison throughout the history, talking one-on-one with prisoners, maybe assisting with reentry. Roberts and Richard Vaux served in dual roles as members of the Philadelphia Society and as presidents of the Board of Inspector until Richard's death in the 1880s. There's an anecdote that suggests that Richard actually died after catching an illness at Eastern State. They describe it as like a cold. Damon's eyebrows are raising, but no, it's all the way through most of the 19th century. And Vaux writes one of the first histories of the building that also provides some of our earliest photographs. We call them the Vaux linens. The picture of the guy working on the chair in his cell is from that series. And then the Quaker influence starts to fade entering the 20th century. There's Roberts and Richard. Richard would be mayor of Philadelphia at one point in the mid-19th century. And there's his book, A Brief Sketch of the History of the Eastern State Penitentiary, yada, yada, yada. Long 19th century title. There are some interesting little tidbits. It seems like there'd be controversy, tension between Orthodox and Hicksite sects of Quakerism. This is an entry, I believe, in the Warden's Daily Journal from Thomas Scattergood in 1849 after a prominent friend, Mary Cayley, I believe her name was, came to minister to a group of prisoners. And he was ticked off that did not refer directly to the Savior. And so I don't know if there's anyone in the group who can talk to that schism, the differences in belief between the Orthodox and the Hicksite. Do you want? Can you feel it? I was afraid of this moment because I was like, I don't think this is theology and this is outside my scope. Okay.
So the Hicksite for the country and the Orthodox for the city, and we go everywhere. Orthodox Street was kept by the Orthodox, we go Bay Street. I'm in media, Providence meeting was Hicksite, so when the county seat for Bill Rotunda moves media, Chester County put in an Orthodox meeting, which is the Third Street, like membership. So the schism is a big fight, but it's not a position.
Okay.
I would add to that Hicksite place, so Orthodox were more kind of leaning towards more mainline Christianity, so there is more of an emphasis on the Bible and on the figure of Jesus, and Orthodox Quakers started to have clergy, paid clergy, and the dynamic, the city versus country dynamic, I would just flag as the dynamic in Philadelphia is switched versus schisms in the rest of the country, but that's true in Philadelphia.
And so the way I interpreted this was Scattergood seemed peeved that they were maybe focused this.
That's an Orthodox Quaker complaining.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Scattergood was an Orthodox Quaker, and he seemed peeved that this person was orienting someone towards their internal experience versus, say, connecting them with the Savior. And then it was so remarkable that the officers were chatting about it afterwards at the water cooler.
And the schism occurred in 1827, 1828, so this
Yeah.
is like really fresh for people. These are people who lived through the schism.
Thank you. That helps a lot. Okay. We're going to zip through a little bit of this. We talked a little bit about the central rotunda, but that's just a fun photograph from the 1890s showing the space in operation. And we can get a better sense of this panoptic radial plan. Whoa. I'm getting way more fun out of this than you guys are. It's really entertaining.
I will say, for those that haven't been to Eastern State, the video doesn't do this justice of when you're standing in the middle, like huge room.
Yeah. And so the thinking behind this plan basically is kind of like almost the inverse of the Panopticon. It's the idea is that if you can see the places where prisoners shouldn't be, then everything's hunky-dory, which kind of made sense if everyone's supposed to be in their cells all the time. The prisoners have patrolled the lawns between the blocks. There's also an observation deck above center for a while. Okay. Despite the, arguably humanitarian, nonviolent roots of the building, the place was a pretty serious and severe institution. So the first thing that would have happened to Charles when he arrived, he would have his clothes taken from him. He was given a haircut, a bath, a new set of clothes, and he was assigned a number, the order of his arrival. So he was number 1. And part of his uniform included a mask, which was put over his face to disorient him and ostensibly prevent any kind of affiliation between prisoners. So I can't see your face, you can't see my face, and we all leave here with a clean slate and start over. Now, a prison historian would probably argue that it was a little more subtle than that, a little more about the kind of forcing someone to submit, making it easier to submit to the authority, but
Social death.
social death, exactly. So if you're going to be the most famous prison in the world, you're also going to be the most criticized prison in the world. Criticism mounted going into the mid-19th century, mainly about the damage solitary confinement might have been doing to the prisoners. The most famous critic was Charles Dickens. He visited in 1842 on his first trip to the US. He interviewed a bunch of prisoners. He was given full run of the institution by his own account and left really grossed out and wrote an 11-page report in a book called American Notes, which was published all over the world. Did a lot of damage to the reputation of the building. And he wrote this famous quote, "I hold the slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." Yeah.
Can I just add a quick voice to the story?
Sure.
How did you plan to talk about Elizabeth during trial?
I actually hit her slide because I didn't know enough about her to speak. I decided I wasn't an expert on her.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I would just say that she's a British Quaker prison activist, and around this time, she is testifying in British context, speaking against solitary confinement.
Yeah. So the Quakers were really, really busy in England reforming prisons, so it wasn't just over here. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, I had her, and I was just like, I don't think I know enough.
She's very famous. She's on the British High Court.
Yeah. And apparently she was inspired to visit Newgate Prison in New York by a Philadelphia Society member. I was going to talk about that, but again, not an expert on that story. Yeah.
I was reading something about this fellow. They did a thing on mall planners, and her mother was laid in the streets. She was born in Newgate. There was a lot of things going on in Newgate, like mostly like they weren't really the poor people. These are people like middle class that were going to prison, debtors prison, the workhouse, the kids are being put in a workhouse. Charlie Chaplin's mom, she was on the stage, but she started to go mentally incompetent, and then they put her in Newgate was some kind of prison, I don't remember what it was, but Charlie Chaplin said. He wrote a book that it was all about, he said, the worst thing in his life he ever considered is that when they put his mother away, that he never forgot that. He said he said it was always endemic to his mind until the day he died.
Yeah, and Dickens' father was incarcerated, so that seemed to be formative to him too. Jen, I'm probably going way over time. How much time do you think I have? I can, yeah. So I can zip along a little further. So there was also some definitely like hypocrisy in the early administration. Even Samuel Wood, who was a prominent Quaker, would resort to violent tactics to keep order. When the rubber hit the road, people don't want to be in solitary confinement. They found all sorts of ways to fight back and break the rules, destroying their work equipment and cussing out overseers and trying to escape, all sorts of ways. So people didn't necessarily go with the program. The prison used things like ice baths and starvation diets and dark cells to keep prisoners in line. And this eventually bubbled up in a really splashy legislative committee investigation from 1834 to 1835. And it was really big news. This is a handbill circulating Philadelphia at the time, and using some pretty strong language, calling this device known as the Iron Gag an implement of torture. It was a metal bit forced into the mouth, chained to the back of the head, and then down to a pair of gloves in a really high stress position. We know that it was used at the Walnut Street Jail. The US Navy used it. And one prisoner even died in the device. His name is down there in the second sentence in the middle. His name probably pronounced different ways, Matthias McCumsey. He had been punished for trying to communicate with his fellow prisoners. And the investigation is about cruel and unusual punishment, but another bunch of other issues, administrative corruption and what they call licentious behavior, maybe sex between staff and prisoners, all sorts of stuff. So definitely, there's a second image, a woodcut from the investigation. So this was big news. It was a big deal. Ultimately, the administration is let off the hook with a warning. The warden keeps his job. The gag goes missing. They ask him to show it at testimony and hearings, and they can't find it. But it gives us a lot of insight into, the dual nature of the building and, some of the hypocrisy in the early philosophy. Questions about that? Sorry, it's a pretty graphic picture. Cool. All right, so investigations, criticisms, questions about whether this worked or not. Really, the biggest problem is overcrowding. Pennsylvania was rapidly growing at the time. Prison construction did not keep pace. By the end of the Civil War, there were extra prisoners. By the turn of the century, most prisoners had a cellmate. They start bunking prisoners up out of necessity. They start building new cell blocks, but they can't ever really get ahead of the problem. By 1913, the Pennsylvania government changes the law formally and allows prisoners to have cellmates and to spend most of their day outside their cell, like a congregate prison today. So this begins what's called the Congregate Era. These prisoners are making shoes together. Sub-theme of this, look at all the fun knickknacks and tchotchkes on the wall. Some more evidence for decoration. You can even see a rocking chair tucked in the back there. In total, about 85,000 men, women, and children were incarcerated at Eastern State in its total history from all walks of life. Again, most people were white men. They were the vast majority, followed closely, not closely, but a disproportionate amount of black men, then black women, then white women, then basically every other ethnic and racial group we can think of.
You say men, women, and children?
Mm-hmm.
Men and women, I understand, but the children.
Yeah, so we've counted about 850 people between the ages of 11 and 17 incarcerated throughout the prison's whole history. In the 19th century, the vast majority of children incarcerated were people of color. There are often diversionary institutions or there are alternatives, but a black child is much more likely to end up in a penitentiary. Yeah. Cell block 14 was built in the late 1920s, and part of its function was to segregate juvenile prisoners. Women were about 2% of the prison's population, about 1,000 in total, so like 1,000 out of 85,000. They were there from 1831 to 1923. They would eventually be segregated in their own cell block 2, but left after the 1923 grand jury investigation into the building that brought up a whole host of issues, and the new warden thought it was good for them to go to their own prison, which was newly built. It was called Muncie, still open. Any question about women or children or anything? Yeah, so some people, matured and grew into an adulthood. The 2 youngest children, we have a boy and a girl on record at the age of 11. The girl, Mary Ash, died at the age of 13 in the building from tuberculosis.
So there was a high concentration of folks and people of color back then, like 1800, something like that, right?
Yeah,
And then you have to also remember that a lot of things like dysentery and typhoid and everything else was at the door.
for sure. At one point, they even post like advisory posters in the cells telling prisoners to stop drinking the water, and they started serving boiled water. But public health, as we all know, public health messages don't always get received.
So bad. Right.
Yikes! No, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
In the previous picture, that thing was so that they hold their head in the right position.
Yeah, it kind of looks like they're plugged in the matrix, right? So we used to always say that it was so that their picture wouldn't blur because of the long exposure time for the photographic technology. I just gave a tour to the Philadelphia Conservation Association. I think that's their title. And one conservator said that she thought that it was more likely that they were trying to create a uniform distance between their heads and the border, kind of like a passport photo. So it could be both. I don't know. Yeah, it's spooky though, right? It's weird.
So at kind of the parallel eastern state of Mexico, like in Berry, they isolated prisoners by sexuality and then they classified them. That's why in Mexican Spanish they call gay people Jays. Did eastern state ever have an isolation room or area for people that were sexual deviants?
People who may identify as LGBTQ plus, that's a complicated question. We do know at one point there were areas like the gallery of subblock 4 and 5 that housed people that were both in punishment solitary, but also in protective, what they thought was necessary protective solitary. And there are various oral histories that comment on prison sexuality at the time. We've counted about 500 folks roughly that were in for the crime of sodomy. And the prison really, or the court system often didn't distinguish between consensual and non-consensual relationships. So it's a really muddy territory. There's some evidence to suggest that people are incarcerated in eastern states simply for gay or trans.
What kills me is that was there anything I wouldn't know about is the penitentiary, but what Sing Sing and some of these prisons, they were execution. Was it prevalent in the East Penitentiary?
Executions? Nobody was ever executed in eastern state. Until 1835, executions were public. And then they were done behind the walls of county jails until 1915. It was hanging up until that point. Then Pennsylvania built a prison called Rockview. That's supposed to be like a centralized location. That's up by Penn State. And then that was electric chair until 1962. And then it switched to lethal injection, which it would be today, but we're abolitionists.
We're at about 7:20, so we want to do 10 more minutes, and then we have
Yeah.
plenty of time. We're open till 8, so then we have lots of time for questions, and I'll stuff a much more casual. So I'll say maybe 10 more minutes with this formal presentation, so we don't get overstretched.
Okay.
Give you a helpful time to do the clock.
I'm going to do the whole 20th century of Eastern State essentially in this little film here. So going into the 20th century, problems continue to mount as the population rapidly grows, almost quadrupling, hitting its peak at about 1800 and 1931. If you want the most reliable way to make a dysfunctional, dangerous prison is to put too many people into it. And that's what happens in Eastern states. So there is a surge in all the bad stuff you might associate with prison, violence and escapes and But their life also became maybe a little bit more multifaceted. People had opportunities to go to church and enter a spiritual community, go to work, take classes. There's tons of examples of fraternity and goodwill inside the prison. There was a group called the Honor and Friendship Club that was kind of like, I would describe it as almost like a fraternal organization that had a number of responsibilities, boosting morale in the building, helping people re-enter, all sorts of responsibilities. One responsibility was helping people that died in the building that didn't have accommodations for a proper burial. They made sure they got a proper burial instead of ending up in front of the anatomical board.
Where do they get buried?
Where do they get buried?
Where will they bury them on, like, close to Eastern State or elsewhere?
We don't know exactly. Our collections manager went down like a super deep rabbit hole with this. There were a number of Potter's Fields communal graves throughout Philadelphia. We identified one in 19th and Fairmount, which would probably be the physically closest one. I think we also found one down at like Mount Vernon or Green Street. We don't have direct evidence that they went there. That would be a logical jump. Yeah, nobody was ever buried at Eastern State. There were morgues for temporary storage, but yeah. So we see the building totally different, right? People together, working together. We get a sense of the crowding. We see just how much the building is doing the exact opposite of what it was built to do. If you want to watch this whole thing, you can watch it on YouTube. You just Google Eastern State 1929. So I'm going to keep moving so we can. Baseball, church, the synagogue. We think we have America's first prison synagogue at Eastern State. Okay, I ripped that quote from your presentation. So one more Quaker story, and I feel in the hot seat because you're the expert. So there was a notable Quaker reformer and advocate named Anna Wharton Morris. She was born shortly after the Civil War, and she was an elite socialite. She was the daughter of Joseph Wharton, an industrialist and founder of the Wharton School. And so she's used to hobnobbing, and she was at the top of the social ladder, but she was super, super passionate about prison reform. Thomas Mott Osborne, one of the most famous prison reformers of all time, said that she was the only person he could trust in Pennsylvania. She reputedly spent like $100,000 of her own money at the turn of the century in her reform efforts. So she was really, really involved. And she was in correspondence apparently with a couple of Eastern State prisoners, including a guy who went by many names. My favorite one is Frederick Funk, but also Edward Mitchell. I'm going to call him Freddie Funk for the rest of this because I like the name. Conditions at Eastern State in the early 1920s and the late 19-teens were really bad. It seems like most evidence suggests that it was a really tough time to live at Eastern State. And so Funk supplied Morris with a number of cartoons that not only show us what things were really like at Eastern State from, well, at least Funk's perspective, but were also maybe used in a splashy investigation that ended up in some really major reforms at Eastern State. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Anna Wharton Morris, I believe, was involved in initiating that lawsuit.
Yeah, so in 1920, the Civil Service Reform Association wrote a report. It was co-authored by Anna Wharton Morris. She was accused, the group was accusing the prison of nepotism, cruelty, and mismanagement. I love this description of her. She was described as a tall and forceful woman. So she was really apparently a force to deal with. So one of the major charges was that both the warden and the deputy warden, Robert McKenty and Robert Byers, had upwards of 12 family members on the prison payroll. They were being paid around 36 grand annually. And McKenty, in turn, threatened to file a libel lawsuit against the civil service reform. Although the Reform Association retracted the charges against McKenty, there was mounting criticism and accusations, and this kind of war started to mount in the newspaper, and people got wind that things were not as they should be at Eastern State. So a little bit about Funk. Mitchell, he was born in 1885 in Buffalo, New York, and he was incarcerated at Eastern State twice between 1918 and 1930 for forgery and larceny charges. And he was a pretty good artist. So it's a long series of cartoons. I'm only going to share a few of them. I think we only have the rights to share a few publicly, permission to share a few publicly. This is my favorite one. It's called A Foul Corner in the ESP. So we see some prisoner solidarity, dead rats all over the place. Everyone's complaining, like put lids on the garbage cans. The one guy says the Board of Health should be notified. So suggesting that it was a pretty gross place to live. This one is some kind of prison official and a guard, maybe the doctor, looming over a sick prisoner, complaining that the food made him sick. They think he's malingering or faking it. And so he says, you know, if you're feeling so bad, why don't we send you to the hospital and give you an ice bath, and then maybe you'll feel better. Suggesting obviously an ice bath will, you know, cure you of your problems, whether they're real or not. And then this is one of showing a really accurate depiction of an Eastern State hallway. I love this cartoon. It shows us a bunch of little things that I love, but basically everyone's shouting out, calling for the doctor's help and complaining about, you know, the crappy treatment they receive. There's lots of little things I like.
And what year was this?
The cartoons are drawn in 1920. Yeah, and I think we even show it in one, there's a calendar where it says 1920. But you can see like little things like gas fittings, and pipe fittings are all torn out now. A little chalkboard, looks like a chalkboard that might have had notes about the prisoner. Those are not there anymore. Little things like that. So calls on the governor to investigate the prison occurred repeatedly throughout the early 20s, and it eventually mounted into a grand jury investigation in the spring of 1923. And it was a really comprehensive report. The investigators are totally blown away by what they see. They describe it as a carnival of lawlessness. There's apparently like a denouement when a group of prisoners, you know, take over an office and start ordering officers around. And they call it an era of self-rule. There's a serious opioid epidemic, a group called the Four Horsemen, what they call a prison clique, basically a prison gang, is running like a heroin, alcohol, and sex trade. So probably a real low point for the prison. So it's kind of hard to say what role the cartoons play directly in the investigation, but it is a really awesome example of prisoner advocacy and also, you know, Quaker dedication to reform, especially in the prison space. Anything else you'd add to it? So some of the outcomes of the investigation: the warden McKenty was forced to resign. Most of his family got the axe too. They built cell block 14 to increase space, but also to separate juveniles. They built the dining halls. There was a new visitation space to eliminate contraband getting in the building or reduce it. Changes in the way guards were training. Ultimately, a lot of guards would lose their job shortly after this investigation. Women were transferred to their own facility. Major security overhauls like guard towers, riot gates, moving the warden's office to the front. But there's a lot of evidence that things didn't get that much better. There were a number of riots in the early 30s over a number of issues, including lack of labor, inadequate wages, excessive use of solitary confinement. And then Gradeford was opened in 1928, which was out in Montgomery County for many, it's still there. It closed in, was that 2017, replaced by SCI Phoenix, but that they've been calling for it to be built for years, but this report seems to be like one of the last pushes to get it built. Okay, so those are some footage from, or pictures from the rioting. This is Leo Callahan. Got to talk about an escape. Leo Callahan escaped right after the investigation. Those guard towers hadn't been put in yet. And he used the lack of guard towers to climb over the east wall with a ladder he made in the prison's wood shop. 5 other guys escaped with him. And he was never recaptured. All of his buddies were, his fellow escapees were caught. So that's embarrassing. They're Philadelphia firefighters taking down the grappling hooks that they used to get down the other side on Corinthian Avenue. It happened in broad daylight too, apparently, which was extra embarrassing. So that gives you a better sense of how the building grew and expanded and what it closer to what it looks like today. So it's a very claustrophobic and crowded place in the middle of a residential neighborhood. Some people didn't really care very much. Some viewed it as an unwelcome neighbor. It sometimes got back in the newspapers because of celebrity prisoners like Al Capone or Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber. People love to come see Al Capone, the recreation of Al Capone's cell. There was a newspaper, it's getting cut off by the Zoom banner, but a newspaper article that described Capone's cell as luxurious and special and fancy in the Park Avenue section of the building. As historians, we're not really sure how accurate that is. We have contrary evidence. Another newspaper describes it as not that impressive. We don't have any of his artifacts or any photos or anything like that. So we know he had a cellmate. We know he got his tonsils taken out, but not too much else. You can only do 7.5 months for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. So he was just in for a handgun charge for a little bit. So the prison going into the 60s and 70s was a wind down phase. The population was dwindling. The writing was on the wall. Time to close this old dumpy prison. It even became sort of known as an old timers prison with older guys incarcerated on average. But abandon it they did. So January 1970, the state left with no plans for its reuse. The city borrowed it or used it for a couple of months going into 71. When there was a large insurrection or riot in the city system. But when they left, it was totally abandoned. There was nobody here to take care of the building. One guy, a city streets employee, apparently took care of like the radiators and stuff and chased people who were picking scrap iron and things like that. He also took care of a feral cat colony. But the building falls into great disrepair. Trees, water, ice do most of the damage. The building had National Historic Landmark status starting in 1965. That kept the bulldozers at bay long enough until a historic site could be built. And so we opened in 1994, and our mission today is to save the building, offer lots of daytime public programming, but also to try to get people to think critically about our prison system, about mass incarceration, and the legacy of Eastern State. So that information I showed you in the beginning, well, we've got it in 3D, 16 feet tall. It's called the Big Graph. Every audio tour ends at it, and it just kind of confronts our visitors with the numbers of mass incarceration. Good or bad or right or wrong, I guess it's up to you folks, but we think that if we can get people thinking about it, again, that's awesome. This side, again, shows us how we compare to pretty much every country on planet Earth. If you're looking for us, there we are at the top. And then this side shows us who goes to prison in this country, exposing the shameful racial disparities in our prison system and how they've developed over time. So we always want visitors to consider how their identity, who they are, how they've moved through the world shapes their relationship to the criminal justice system. And then we just walk away from it there. Woo. So my closing question for you guys, going back to Quaker stuff, how do you guys think the Quaker community should view their contributions to the creation of the American prison system, the creation of Eastern State? I don't want to overstate their contributions, but it's there, as I think I made the case for. Since we're running low on time, that'll be like a to-go question. Come see us.